The last rope. The rope hung down the cliff face of Hacksaw Ridge like a frayed lifeline to hell itself, its fibers darkened with mud and rain from the April storm that had turned Okinawa's coral limestone into a treacherous slick. Desmond Doss crouched at the edge of the plateau, his hands wrapped around the anchor point where the 77th Infantry Division had secured their only reliable evacuation route. Below him, stretcher-bearers waited in the relative safety of the lower ground, their faces turned upward through the mist and smoke. The rope trembled under his grip, not from wind, but from the weight of Private Morrison, who hung suspended in a makeshift harness halfway down the cliff. Doss could hear the wounded man's labored breathing echoing off the rock face, punctuated by the distant crack of Japanese rifles from the caves that honeycombed the ridge. Each shot seemed aimed at the rope itself, as if the enemy understood that cutting this single strand would trap every wounded American on the plateau above. "Easy, Morrison," Doss whispered, though he knew his voice wouldn't carry through the rain and gunfire. His own hands shook as he fed more rope through the anchor system, lowering the stretcher inch by careful inch. The fiber was beginning to fray where it bent over the sharp coral edge, individual strands popping under the strain like tiny rifle shots. Morrison was the third man he'd lowered this morning, and already the rope showed dangerous wear. 13 more wounded lay scattered across the plateau behind him, some conscious and watching his every move, others lost in the grey fog of shock and pain. The morning assault had collapsed within hours, sending the 77th Infantry Division scrambling back down the ridge in chaos. Every medic had withdrawn with the main force, every medic except one. The evacuation order had come at 800 hours, barked through the static of field radios as mortar rounds walked across the plateau. All personnel withdraw immediately, ridge untenable. Captain Reynolds himself had grabbed Doss by the shoulder, shouting over the explosions, "Move it, Doc, we can't hold this position." But Doss had looked back at the scattered forms of the wounded, heard their calls for help cutting through the artillery, and felt his feet root to the muddy ground. "Sir, there are still men up here." "Dead men if they stay," Reynolds had replied, already moving toward the rope lines. "That's an order, Doss." The order still rang in his ears as he worked alone on the plateau, but louder were the voices of the wounded calling his name. Sergeant Hayes lay unconscious near a collapsed cave entrance, his breathing shallow and rapid. Corporal Jenkins had taken shrapnel through his shoulder and couldn't use his left arm. Private Coleman kept asking for his mother in a voice barely above a whisper. As Morrison finally reached the bottom and disappeared into the waiting hands of the stretcher-bearers, Doss hauled the rope back up, his palms already raw from the coarse fiber. The enemy fire was intensifying as the Japanese realized someone was still moving on the abandoned plateau. Bullets snapped through the air around the cliff edge, forcing him to work from behind whatever cover he could find. He secured the rope around Sergeant Hayes, whispering a quick prayer as he lifted the unconscious man onto the improvised stretcher. The rope groaned under the new weight, and Doss could see more strands beginning to separate where the fiber bent over the rock. How many more trips could it handle? How many more men could he lower before the whole system failed? The answer came from below in the voice of a stretcher-bearer calling up through the mist. "How many more up there, Doc?" Doss looked back at the plateau, counting forms in the smoke and rain. Some were sitting up, others lay still, waiting their turn. His voice cracked as he called back down. 12 more after this one." 12 more trips on a rope that was already failing. 12 more chances for a sniper's bullet to find its mark or for the anchor system to give way under the strain. But as he began lowering Hayes into the grey void below, Doss found himself whispering the prayer that would carry him through the longest day of his life. "Lord, help me get just one more." The rope continued its work, strand by strand, man by man, as the storm clouds gathered over Hacksaw Ridge and the Japanese prepared for their counterattack. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. Private Danny Chen pulled his poncho tighter against the rain as he watched the lone figure working at the cliff edge above. From his position with the stretcher teams at the base of Hacksaw Ridge, he could barely make out Doss through the smoke and mist, but the steady rhythm of wounded men coming down the rope told the story clearly enough. The medic, who wouldn't carry a rifle, was still up there, still working 3 hours after the official withdrawal order. "He's going to get himself killed," muttered Corpsman Williams, checking his watch for the 4th time in 10 minutes. The 77th Infantry Division's aid station had been overwhelmed since dawn, with casualties from the failed assault streaming down the muddy slopes of Okinawa's most contested terrain. Williams had seen plenty of heroes in his 2 years with the unit, but nothing like this stubborn refusal to follow orders. Chen caught the next wounded man as he reached the bottom, helping transfer him to a stretcher with practiced efficiency. Private Coleman, conscious but pale from blood loss, gripped Chen's sleeve as they carried him toward the medical tent. "He came back for me," Coleman whispered, his eyes unfocused but earnest. "Everyone else was gone. But Doss came back, crawled through machine gun fire to get me." The rope disappeared back up into the grey void above, and Chen found himself counting the minutes until it would return with another casualty. Each trip seemed to take longer than the last, and the sound of gunfire from the plateau never stopped. Japanese mortars were walking closer to the cliff edge with each barrage, and sooner or later they'd find the range. Captain Reynolds crouched under the command tarp, his field radio crackling with reports from other sectors of the Okinawan front. The April offensive was stalled all along the line, with American forces discovering that every ridge and cave system had been turned into an elaborate defensive network. But the situation at Hacksaw Ridge was unique. They'd managed to take the plateau for exactly 4 hours before being driven back, and now one unarmed medic was conducting his own private rescue mission in broad daylight. "Sir, we need to send a team up to get him," suggested Lieutenant Morrison, gesturing toward the cliff face. "Doss has been up there alone for 3 hours. The Japs are going to zero in on that rope soon enough." Reynolds studied the terrain through his field glasses, noting the fresh shell craters appearing closer to the cliff edge with each enemy barrage. The Japanese had pulled back into their cave systems after repelling the morning assault, but their observation posts commanded a clear view of the plateau. They knew exactly what was happening. "He's disobeying a direct order," Reynolds said quietly, more to himself than to Morrison. "By all rights, I should court-martial him when he comes down." "If he comes down," Morrison replied. The rope reappeared at the cliff edge, and this time Chen could see 2 figures working together, Doss and someone else, probably one of the walking wounded helping with the evacuation. Corporal Jenkins descended slowly, his left arm useless, but his right hand gripping the rope guidelines. When he reached the bottom, his face was grey with pain, but his eyes were clear. "How many more up there?" Chen asked, as they loaded Jenkins onto a stretcher. 8, maybe 9, Jenkins gasped. "Some are pretty bad. Thompson's got internal bleeding and Martinez hasn't been conscious since the mortar hit near his position. But Doss," he shook his head in amazement, "that man's got ice water in his veins. Bullets flying everywhere, and he's calm as Sunday morning, bandaging wounds and rigging stretchers." Williams checked his medical supplies, noting how quickly their field dressings and morphine were disappearing. Each casualty Doss sent down required immediate triage and treatment, stretching their resources thin. But none of the wounded had died on the way down. Somehow, the medic on the plateau was stabilizing them well enough to survive the dangerous rope descent. The rhythm continued through the afternoon, punctuated by brief lulls when enemy fire forced Doss to take cover. During these pauses, Chen found himself staring up at the cliff edge, wondering what kind of man could ignore direct orders and work alone in the most dangerous place on Okinawa. The other medics had followed proper procedure, withdrawing with their units when the position became untenable. Only Doss had stayed behind. As the 7th casualty reached the bottom, Private Thompson. Barely conscious but alive, the rope showed visible signs of deterioration. Individual strands had snapped under the repeated stress, and the anchor point was beginning to cut into the coral rock. Chen could see Doss working frantically at the cliff edge, probably trying to reinforce the system with whatever materials he could find. "That rope's not going to hold much longer," Williams observed, testing the tension as they hauled it back up. "Maybe 2 more trips. 3 if he's lucky." Chen looked back toward the medical tents where 14 wounded men were receiving treatment. 14 men who would have died on the plateau if one stubborn medic hadn't refused to follow orders. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. Doss was trading his own life, minute by minute, for each man he sent down the rope. Through the rain and smoke they could hear him calling down from the plateau, "2 more coming! Get ready! 2 more, and then what?" Chen gripped his rifle and wondered if he had the courage to climb that rope himself when the time came. Because someone would have to go up and get Doss, assuming there was anything left to bring down. The rope burned through Doss's palms as he lowered the 8th casualty, leaving his hands slick with blood and rainwater. Private Martinez hung unconscious in the stretcher harness, his breathing so shallow that Doss had to press his ear to the man's chest to confirm a heartbeat. The makeshift pulley system was falling apart strand by strand, and each trip down the cliff face of Hacksaw Ridge seemed more precarious than the last. From his position at the anchor point, Doss could see the Japanese movement in the cave entrances across the plateau. They were positioning for something, either a counterattack to retake the ridge completely or a concentrated effort to cut his rope and trap the remaining wounded. Either way, time was running out for his impossible rescue mission. The radio chatter from the 77th Infantry Division's command post had been crackling through abandoned equipment all morning, painting a grim picture of the April offensive across Okinawa. Other units were reporting similar setbacks, with American forces discovering that every piece of high ground had been turned into a fortress. But nowhere else was a single unarmed medic conducting a one-man evacuation under direct enemy fire. Dr. Sarah Mitchell worked frantically in the aid station below as the 9th wounded soldier arrived from above. As chief medical officer for the battalion, she'd seen plenty of battlefield casualties, but the steady stream from Hacksaw Ridge was unlike anything in her experience. Each man arrived stabilized and properly bandaged, despite being treated under conditions that should have made medical care impossible. "How's he doing this?" she muttered to herself, checking Martinez's pulse and finding it stronger than expected. Field medicine under machine gun fire shouldn't be this precise. Corpsman Williams looked up from changing Private Coleman's dressing, his face grim with exhaustion. "That medic's been up there for 4 hours, Doc. Working alone, no backup, enemy closing in from 3 sides, he should be dead 10 times over." Through the medical tent's opening, Mitchell could see the rope disappearing back up into the grey mist that shrouded the plateau. The sound of gunfire never stopped, rapid bursts of Japanese machine guns mixing with the occasional crack of American rifles from other sectors. But from Hacksaw Ridge itself, only enemy weapons could be heard. Doss was working in territory completely controlled by Japanese forces. Private Chen crouched beside the ammunition cases that served as his observation post, watching the cliff face through field glasses. As a replacement in the 77th Infantry Division, he'd heard stories about the strange medic who refused to carry weapons, but seeing Doss work under fire was something altogether different. The man moved across the plateau with deliberate calm, ignoring bullets that snapped past his head as he tended to the wounded. "Contact!" Chen called out as he spotted muzzle flashes from multiple cave entrances. The Japanese were firing in coordinated bursts now, trying to bracket the area around the rope anchor point. Mortar rounds began falling in a pattern, walking closer to the cliff edge with each explosion. At the command post, Captain Reynolds studied his tactical maps with growing unease. Intelligence reports indicated that Japanese reinforcements were moving through the tunnel systems beneath Hacksaw Ridge, preparing for a major counterattack before nightfall. When it came, any American forces still on the plateau would be cut off and destroyed. "Sir, we need to send a squad up to extract Doss," Lieutenant Morrison urged, pointing to the cliff face. "He's disobeying orders, but we can't just leave him up there to die." Reynolds lowered his field glasses, watching the rope system strain under the weight of another casualty descending through the smoke. "Send a squad up there, and we'll just have more men trapped when the counterattack hits." Doss knew the risks when he decided to stay behind. But even as he spoke, Reynolds found himself counting the wounded arriving at the aid station. 9 men who would have died on the plateau. 9 families who would receive different telegrams because one medic had refused to follow orders. The mathematics of heroism were more complex than the mathematics of military discipline. The 10th casualty reached the bottom as enemy fire intensified around the cliff edge. Sergeant Hayes was conscious but weak from blood loss, and he gripped Chen's sleeve as they loaded him onto a stretcher. "He's got 3 more up there," Hayes gasped, his voice hoarse from pain and exhaustion. "But the rope's about done. I could feel it giving way on the trip down. Maybe one more load, 2 if he's lucky." Dr. Mitchell looked up from her patient as the implications sank in. 3 more wounded, and a rope system that might fail at any moment? Hayes nodded grimly. "He knows it too. Asked me to tell you folks that if the rope breaks, don't send anybody else up. Said his peace with the Lord is already made." The medical tent fell silent except for the soft groans of wounded men and the distant sound of gunfire from the plateau. Through the opening, they could see the rope hanging motionless in the rain, waiting for Doss to rig the next casualty for evacuation. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. Somewhere above, in the smoke and rain, a man who had never fired a shot in anger was preparing to risk everything one more time. The sound of his voice drifted down through the mist, calling to the wounded who remained. "Hold on, just a little longer. We're going to get you home." The rope snapped on the 11th trip down. Doss felt it go as Private Thompson hung suspended 20 feet below the cliff edge of Hacksaw Ridge, a sudden release of tension that sent his heart hammering against his ribs. The main line held, but 2 of the 3 anchor strands had parted under the repeated stress, leaving the entire system hanging by fibers that popped and stretched ominously in the rain. Thompson's terrified voice echoed up from the grey void. "Doc! Doc! Something's wrong!" Moving purely on instinct, Doss wrapped his bleeding hands around the remaining rope and began lowering Thompson the rest of the way by pure muscle power, his shoulders screaming as he fought gravity and the wounded man's dead weight. 30 feet of burning fiber slid through his palms before Thompson finally reached the stretcher-bearers below, and Doss collapsed backward onto the muddy coral of the plateau, his hands shaking uncontrollably. 2 men remained on Hacksaw Ridge, Corporal Jenkins with a shattered collarbone, and Private Morrison, who hadn't regained consciousness since a mortar fragment had grazed his skull. The rope system that had carried 11 wounded soldiers to safety was finished, its frayed end hanging uselessly over the cliff edge, and somewhere in the cave systems around the plateau, Japanese voices were calling to each other with increasing urgency. Jenkins crawled over to where Doss lay, staring at the grey sky, rain washing the blood and cordite from his face. "Doc, we got to get out of here. That rope's done for, and the Japs are moving around in those caves. They're planning something big." But Doss was already moving, his hands fumbling through his medical kit for anything that might serve as rope or cable. He found tent stakes, bandages, strips of canvas from torn shelter halves. Nothing strong enough to support a man's weight over the cliff face. The official evacuation route was closed, but there had to be another way. Down below, Dr. Mitchell watched the rope end, swaying in the wind, and felt her heart sink. 11 wounded men lay in her aid station, all alive because of one medic's stubborn courage. But 2 more remained on the plateau, and the only evacuation route had just failed catastrophically. "We need to get a ladder truck up here," Corpsman Williams suggested, studying the cliff face through field glasses. "Maybe rig a new rope system from scratch." Captain Reynolds shook his head grimly as he monitored radio traffic from other units. "No time. Intelligence says the Japs are massing for a counterattack all along this sector. In 30 minutes, that plateau's going to be swarming with enemy troops." Private Chen gripped his rifle, watching the cliff edge where nothing moved except blowing smoke and rain. "Sir, we can't just leave them up there. 3 Americans trapped on that ridge." "2 Americans and 1 stubborn medic who chose to ignore direct orders," Reynolds corrected, but his voice lacked conviction. The pile of wounded soldiers in the medical tent argued against any simple judgment of Doss's actions. On the plateau, Doss found his answer in the wreckage of the morning assault. A communications cable lay half buried in the mud near a destroyed radio position, its copper core still intact despite the rubber coating being torn by shrapnel. 50 feet of wire, maybe 60, not enough to reach the bottom of the cliff, but possibly sufficient to lower a man partway down where the stretcher-bearers could reach him with a ladder or shorter rope. He rigged Morrison first, the unconscious soldier secured in a makeshift harness cobbled together from torn uniform strips and equipment straps. The communications wire bit into his raw palms as he lowered Morrison into the mist, praying that someone below would understand what he was trying to do. Shouts echoed up from the base of the cliff as the stretcher-bearers spotted Morrison's descent and scrambled to position themselves with ropes and makeshift ladders. Jenkins watched the evacuation with growing amazement. "Doc, that wire's not going to hold for 2 trips. It's already stretching under Morrison's weight." Doss nodded, understanding the mathematics perfectly. 1 more trip, and then the improvised system would fail just as completely as the rope had. Jenkins was mobile despite his broken collarbone, capable of rappelling down with assistance. But that would leave Doss alone on the plateau with no way down and Japanese reinforcements moving through the tunnel system. "You go next," Doss said quietly, testing the wire tension. "I'll find another way." "Like hell," Jenkins replied. "You're the one saved all of us. I'm not leaving you up here to get overrun." For a moment, both men crouched in the rain-soaked shell crater that had become their final refuge, listening to the sound of enemy movement growing closer. Morrison had reached the bottom safely, but the communications wire was stretched to its breaking point. 1 more evacuation was possible, but only 1. Below them, the stretcher-bearers were rigging their own rope system, trying to reach partway up the cliff to meet whoever came down next. Dr. Mitchell worked frantically to prepare for the final casualties while Captain Reynolds monitored his watch, knowing that time was running out for whatever impossible plan Doss might devise. The wire hummed with tension as Doss secured it around Jenkins' waist, his movements deliberate despite the machine gun fire that was growing more accurate with each burst. "Tell them I got all the wounded down safe," he said, helping Jenkins to the cliff edge. "That's what matters." But as Jenkins disappeared into the grey void below, Doss was already studying the terrain around him, looking for something that hadn't occurred to anyone else. Because the medic who wouldn't carry a weapon wasn't finished with Hacksaw Ridge quite yet, what Desmond Doss never told the reporters, never shared in interviews, and never wrote in his own letters home was how he spent the 17 minutes alone on top of Hacksaw Ridge, waiting to die. Jenkins had reached the bottom safely, but the communications wire had snapped during his descent, leaving Doss completely cut off on the plateau, with Japanese voices growing closer through the cave entrances. The rain was stopping, and patches of pale sunlight began breaking through the smoke, illuminating the coral limestone that would become his final position. He crouched beside the abandoned radio equipment, clutching his small prayer book, and faced the truth he'd been avoiding all day. He was going to die on this ridge. Not heroically, not cinematically, but probably badly. Alone, outnumbered, and with no way to defend himself against the enemy soldiers who were already moving through the tunnel systems below. The 12 men he'd lowered to safety would live, but the cost would be his own life, and there was nothing heroic about the terrified prayers he whispered into the gathering wind. The secret that gnawed at him through 17 minutes of eternity was simpler and more human than any citation would ever capture. He hadn't stayed on the plateau because of courage. He'd stayed because he physically couldn't force himself to climb down that rope while wounded men were calling his name. It wasn't noble. It was a kind of spiritual paralysis, an inability to reconcile his training as a medic with his conscience as a human being. In the aid station below, Dr. Mitchell finished treating Jenkins and looked up at the empty cliff face. 13 casualties evacuated, all stable, all alive. But one medic remained trapped above with no apparent means of escape, and Japanese forces preparing their counterattack. The mathematics of the rescue had shifted. 13 lives saved, 1 life lost. Captain Reynolds crouched beside his radio, listening to reports from other units across Okinawa as the April offensive stalled along the entire front. Every American commander was facing similar decisions: when to advance, when to retreat, when to accept losses as inevitable. But none were dealing with a subordinate who had ignored direct orders to achieve the impossible. "Sir, we should send a patrol up the back slope," Lieutenant Morrison suggested, studying his tactical maps. "There might be another route to the plateau through the Japanese positions, and lose 6 more men trying to save 1 medic who chose to stay behind." Reynolds shook his head. Doss made his choice. "We don't compound the loss." But even as he spoke, Reynolds found himself staring at the 13 wounded soldiers in the medical tents. 13 families who would receive telegrams beginning with "wounded in action" instead of "killed in action." The young medic's disobedience had created a moral arithmetic that defied simple military logic. Private Chen maintained his watch on the cliff face, field glasses trained on the plateau, where nothing moved except smoke and wind-blown debris. According to his count, Doss had been alone up there for nearly 20 minutes, with no visible means of escape. The Japanese would find him soon, if they hadn't already. On the plateau, Doss closed his prayer book and made peace with what he thought would be his final minutes. But as he prepared for the enemy's arrival, his trained medic's eyes noticed something the tactical observers below had missed: a narrow ledge system running along the cliff face, hidden from ground view, but potentially accessible from above. It was a desperate chance, but it led toward a section of the ridge that American forces still controlled. The ledge was 18 inches wide at best, slick with rain and broken by gaps where artillery had blasted away sections of coral. One slip meant a 100-foot fall onto the jagged rocks below, but it was a possibility where none had existed before. And Doss had survived this long by taking impossible risks, one measured step at a time. What he didn't know, what no one knew until decades later when classified Japanese documents were translated, was that enemy observers had been tracking his movements all day. They'd watched him lower 12 wounded Americans to safety and had chosen not to interfere, recognizing something in his actions that transcended nationality and warfare. The Japanese soldiers in the caves had their own wounded, their own medics, their own understanding of what it meant to refuse to abandon the helpless. As Doss began his traverse along the narrow ledge, moving one careful handhold at a time away from the plateau, enemy rifles remained silent. It was a silence that would haunt him for the rest of his life, not the sound of gunfire, but the absence of it, suggesting a moment of recognition between enemies that no military history would ever record. The ledge traverse took 43 minutes. 43 minutes of fingertip holds on wet coral, of gaps that had to be jumped on faith, of moving sideways along a cliff face while American observers below held their breath. When Doss finally reached a section where friendly forces could throw him a rope, his hands were torn to ribbons and his uniform was shredded, but he was alive. Dr. Mitchell's hands shook as she cleaned the coral cuts on Doss's palms. understanding that she was treating a man who had achieved something that would be talked about for generations. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw not triumph, but a kind of spiritual exhaustion that would never fully heal. 13 men, she said quietly. 13 lives saved. Doss nodded, staring at his bandaged hands. 13 men who get to go home. But what he didn't say, what he couldn't say, was that part of him had remained on that plateau forever. The part that had learned something about the cost of refusing to abandon people, even when abandoning them would be rational, safe, and militarily sound. The after-action report for Hacksaw Ridge, filed 3 days later by Captain Reynolds, compressed 12 hours of impossible courage into 4 clean sentences. PFC Desmond T. Doss, Medical Detachment, remained on objective after unit withdrawal to evacuate wounded personnel. Doss successfully evacuated 13 casualties under enemy fire using improvised rope systems. Evacuation conducted without loss of life. Recommend unit citation for outstanding performance of duty. Nothing in the official record captured the 17 minutes Doss had spent alone on the plateau, convinced he was about to die. Nothing mentioned the silence of Japanese weapons during his ledge traverse, or the way his hands still trembled 3 days later when he tried to hold a coffee cup. The legend that would grow around Hacksaw Ridge was built on facts, but the weight of those facts lived only in the memories of the men who had been there. Doctor Mitchell watched Doss work in the aid station, noting how he flinched slightly whenever communications wire was visible. His hands had healed quickly, but something in his eyes remained focused on a distant point that none of them could see. She'd treated combat fatigue before, but this was different. Not the shattered nerves of prolonged exposure, but the specific burden of a man who had pushed beyond every reasonable limit and somehow survived. "You should rotate back to a rear area hospital," she suggested during his daily medical check. "Get some rest. Let other medics handle the frontline work for a while." Doss shook his head, testing the flexibility in his bandaged palms. "Men are still getting hurt out there, Doc. They need medics who won't run when things get tough." But Mitchell could see the cost in his movements, the way he unconsciously checked and rechecked his equipment before each patrol, as if memorizing exactly what resources he'd have available when the next impossible situation arose. The medic, who had saved 13 men in 1 day, was already preparing for the next crisis that would test whether courage was renewable or finite. Private Chen, now assigned to stretcher duty, worked alongside Doss during the 77th Infantry Division's advance toward the next ridge system. The Okinawan campaign was far from over, with weeks of brutal fighting still ahead. But the dynamics within the medical detachment had shifted permanently. The other medics looked to Doss with a mixture of awe and concern, understanding that they were working beside someone who had redefined what was possible. "Doc, you ever think about what would have happened if that rope had broken earlier?" Chen asked, during a brief rest between casualty runs. Doss was quiet for a long moment, staring at the coral ridges ahead, where smoke still rose from ongoing battles. "Then I'd have figured out something else. You don't leave wounded men behind because the equipment fails. You find another way." The simplicity of his answer concealed the complexity of what he'd actually experienced. In his private letters home, Doss never mentioned the terror of working alone under fire, never described the moment when he realized the rope was failing, never shared the spiritual crisis of believing himself abandoned on the plateau. Instead, he wrote about the 13 men who'd made it home, about small victories in a war full of losses. Captain Reynolds received the Medal of Honor recommendation for Doss's actions, but found himself struggling with the paperwork. How do you document something that defied military logic? How do you explain why one man's disobedience had achieved more than the entire unit's adherence to proper procedure? The citation would use words like conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty, but Reynolds knew those phrases barely touched the human reality of what had happened on the ridge. Years later, When historians interviewed survivors of Hacksaw Ridge, they would discover that each man remembered different details. Some recalled the sound of the rope straining under repeated loads. Others remembered the silence when Doss disappeared over the cliff edge for his final escape. Dr. Mitchell remembered treating 13 casualties who shouldn't have survived their wounds. But Doss himself remembered mostly the weight of responsibility, the knowledge that 12 human lives hung literally from his bleeding hands, one man at a time. The smell of wet rope never left him completely. Decades after the war, during Oregon thunderstorms, Doss would find himself checking and rechecking the window latches in his house, his hands moving in the familiar pattern of testing knots and anchor points. His wife learned not to ask about these moments, understanding that some memories lived in the body as much as the mind. The official Medal of Honor ceremony in 1945 focused on heroism and national service, with photographers capturing Doss in his dress uniform, his hands steady as he shook the president's hand. But the 13 men he'd lowered from Hacksaw Ridge saw something different when they looked at those photographs. They saw the slight tension around his eyes, the way his fingers unconsciously tested the strength of whatever they touched. Private Morrison, the last conscious man Doss had evacuated, attended the ceremony with his wife and daughter. Afterward, he found Doss standing alone outside the White House, staring at his hands. "Doc, you saved my life up there. Saved all our lives." Doss nodded, but his voice was quiet. "Just did what needed doing, Morrison. Any medic would have done the same." No, but Morrison had been there, had seen the other medics withdraw with the main force, had watched one unarmed man choose to stay behind when every rational consideration argued for retreat. He knew that Doss was wrong. Not any medic would have done the same. Only one had. The legend of Hacksaw Ridge would grow over the decades, inspiring books and films, becoming a symbol of courage and faith under impossible circumstances. But for the men who had been lowered down that failing rope, the story was simpler and more personal. 13 soldiers had called for help, and one medic had refused to let them die alone. In his final years, when asked about the most important moment of his life, Doss would often mention not the Medal of Honor or the public recognition, but the 17 minutes he'd spent alone on the plateau, certain he was about to die, whispering prayers into the wind and making peace with the cost of staying true to his convictions. Those 17 minutes had taught him something about the weight of choosing to help rather than choosing to survive, a lesson that no citation could adequately capture. The rope from Hacksaw Ridge was never recovered. It disappeared into the chaos of the Okinawan campaign, its frayed fibers scattered across a battlefield that claimed 82,000 American casualties before the fighting ended. But its memory lived on in the hands of one medic who had learned that sometimes the most important act of courage is simply refusing to let go. If this story reminded you that behind every medal, there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.